Hello everyone! In this video we will start talking about general and special senses. I will start by defining general and special senses, and then I will go over some terms that are fundamental for you to understand this subject, and then I will finish this video talking about the general sensory receptors that we have. So let's start! We have receptors throughout our body, and we divide them into two main categories, the general senses and the special senses. The general senses are involved with sensing things like temperature, pain, touch, pressure, and vibration all throughout our body. And these general senses are both somatic and visceral senses. So sensation from our internal organs, viscera, falls into the general senses category. Now, the special senses are unique to the head, and it includes our nose, which is related to smell, taste buds, which are related to taste, ears, which are related to balance and hearing, and our eyes, which are related to vision. Now, in this video, I will go over the general senses. When we talk about senses, we need to talk about stimuli. And stimuli are packets of information that can be detected by receptors throughout our body. As you can imagine, there are lots of different types of stimuli, and consequently, we have lots of different types of receptors throughout our body. And these receptors are specialized in detecting a particular type of stimulus. Now, each receptor responds primarily to one stimulus, and that's what we call receptor specificity. And for example, the photoreceptors in our retina, in the retina of our eye, primarily detect photons, which are packets of light. Now, the photoreceptors can also answer to other types of stimulus, such as pressure. So if you go ahead and you rub your eyes, you see flashes of light. And the reason why you see that is because the photoreceptors in our retina, in the retina of your eyes, were activated by pressure stimulus. Obviously, the primary function of the photoreceptors is to detect photons, and that's why we call receptor specificity the ability of each receptor primarily detect one type of stimulus. Now, we say that the sensory receptors are the interface between the nervous system and the environment. And the sensory receptors are capable of informing about the environment, the central nervous system, because they work as transducers. And a transducer is something that can convert one stimulus into another. So what receptors do is they pick up stimuli and convert stimuli into action potentials, because action potentials is the way information travels throughout our body. And then, for example, we have the photoreceptors in our retina converting light stimulus into action potentials. And these action potentials are sent out to our brain, and then our brain interprets those action potentials as visual information. So changes in conditions both inside and outside our body stimulate sensory receptors. And this sensory information generated by an stimulus is called sensation. But the conscious awareness, the interpretation of this sensation, is known as perception. And the perception, the conscious sensation of different stimuli, happens in the cortical areas of our brain. We already know that receptors detect stimuli, but what you need to have clear in your mind is that each receptor has a specific area that it monitors. And this area monitored by a single receptor is called the receptive field. We can have large receptive fields, which cover a large area, or we can have small receptive fields, which cover small areas. When the receptive fields are large, it makes it very difficult to localize a stimulus to one specific area. On the other hand, if the receptive fields are small, you have several receptors close together, and that makes it easy to localize a stimulus. So looking at this diagram, you see two receptive fields. If I touch at two different points inside the same receptive field, for example, here and here, the stimulus will activate the same receptor. Then our brain cannot differentiate into two different stimuli in that area because both stimuli were picked up by the same receptor. However, if I touch at two different points like here and here, and with that I stimulate two different receptive fields, it will stimulate two different receptors. Hence, our brain will be able to identify that as two, and I will feel like two different points of touch. As far as our brain is concerned, if two fingers are pressed in the same receptive field, it cannot interpret that as two. It feels actually as one stimulus. And that's the reason we refer as the smaller receptive fields, the more refined is the ability to localize the stimulus. And the bigger receptive fields, the more difficult it is to localize a specific stimulus. And for example, an area of our body that we have very small receptive fields is our hands. And in our hands, we have very defined ability to recognize a specific stimulus. Now, receptors can respond in different ways, and some receptors are said to be tonic and others are said to be phasic. The tonic receptors are the ones that have more of a constant tone, and the phasic receptors are the ones that get adapted to the stimulus. As I just said, tonic response refers to the fact that receptors can respond in a tone. And a tone is like a constant value. So the tonic receptors are the ones that respond to every single stimulus with the same magnitude. Tonic receptors do not change the way they respond to a particular stimulus. Every time the tonic receptor is stimulated by that specific stimulus, we have the same magnitude of response. And because of that, the tonic receptors are said to be always active. Some tonic receptors examples are the photoreceptors in our retina and also the pain receptors, which are called nociceptors. Pain receptors do not adapt. They keep sending information non-stop to our brain, informing that something is injured in our body. And if we stop and think, it would be really stupid if our pain sensory receptors adapted, because we would never end up going to the doctor trying to fix the problem. So that constant pain letting us know that something is not right, that something is wrong, make us do something about it. Now, we have many receptors throughout our body that respond in a phasic manner, and these are the phasic receptors. In the case of the phasic receptors, the first stimulus will give a certain response, but the next stimulus will get a smaller response, and then a smaller response, and that's what we call adaptation. The fact that receptors become less sensitive to a particular stimulus over the course of time, and therefore we start ignoring that particular stimulus. And an example of phasic receptors are touch receptors. And touch receptors, they do get adapted. For example, when we put our glasses on top of our head and then after a while, we start looking everywhere. We look the entire house for our glasses, and the entire time they were on top of our head. What happened was that when we just placed the glasses on top of our head, our mechanoreceptors were stimulated, but with time they adapted, and we didn't feel it anymore. And if we can feel it, we could not be aware that our glasses were on top of our head. And another example is when we wear perfume or cologne. And when we just apply it, we sense it. But with time, we stop sensing it. Then we go and we meet a friend, and our friend says that likes our perfume. And we are not even aware that we still had it on. So what happened in this case is that the continuous smell led our olfactory receptors to adapt. And with that, the olfactory receptors stopped sending signals to our brain. But this chemical information, the smell, was new to the olfactory receptors of our friend, so our friend was able to smell it. Now, since the tonic receptors are the ones that respond in a constant tone, we can conclude that the phasic receptors are the ones that will give us the different intensities and rate of change of. When we talk about the general sense receptors, we can classify them into two big categories. We classify them by the place where they are located in our body and also by the type of stimulus they can respond to. With respect to the receptor location classification, we divide the receptors into exteroceptors, proprioceptors, and interoceptors. The exteroceptors are receptors that respond to stimuli that are coming from the exterior, from outside of our body, hence the name exteroceptors. These receptors are generally found more superficially, like in our skin, and we are aware of these sensations. Now, we have the proprioceptors, and these are the receptors that respond to stimuli within our body, but they are exclusively related to our understanding of the position and stretch within our joints and tendons. So, proprio means self, right? And proprioceptors are the ones that allow us to know where our limbs are located if we have our eyes closed. So, for example, if we move our arms around while we have our eyes closed, we know where our arms are located. And we just know because the proprioceptors are providing information about our joints position and stretch, which is sent to our brain, and we can be aware of that. Now, lastly, we have the interoceptors, and these are the ones that respond to stimuli that comes from the interior, from within our body, hence the name interoceptors. And we find these receptors in places like the walls of our digestive organs and respiratory organs. And these receptors are the ones involved in detecting things like oxygen levels in our blood and also pressure within the walls of our organs. Now, in the case of the interoceptors, we cannot say that we are always aware of what they are detecting, because in general, we are not aware of what's happening inside our body, right? We generally do not feel what our internal organs are doing. And in those cases that we do feel our internal organs, it's poorly defined and poorly localized. And one of the main sensations we feel from inside our body is pain. But even when we have pain from an internal organ, it's not sharply defined. And what I mean by that is that if we have a pain in our abdomen, we cannot exactly pinpoint which organ the pain is coming from. So we just say that we have a pain in the abdominal area. Now, when we talk about the receptors classification based on the type of stimulus they are capable of responding to, we have mechanoreceptors, which sense physical deformation such as pressure and vibration. And then we have the thermoreceptors, which respond to change in temperature. We have the one that we already talked about, the nociceptors, which are the receptors that respond to pain, so sensation of pain. And then we have the chemoreceptors, which are the receptors that are capable of sensing the chemical environment inside our body. So it senses our body fluids composition, such as the oxygen content in our blood. Mechanoreceptors, as the name implies, respond to mechanical stimuli, and they are the ones responsible for sensing physical deformation such as stretch and compression. And we can classify the mechanoreceptors into three big groups: the tactile receptors, the baroreceptors, and the proprioceptors. Tactile receptors are receptors related to touch, pressure, and vibration. There are lots of tactile receptors in our skin, and in fact, these are some of the most numerous types of receptors we have. There are two general classes of tactile receptors. We have the unencapsulated tactile receptors and we have the encapsulated tactile receptors. When the tactile receptors are unencapsulated, their nerve endings, where the receptors are located, are not wrapped in any connective tissue or glial cells. And these are like free nerve endings. They are not encapsulated at all. On the other hand, the tactile receptors that are encapsulated have their nerve endings wrapped in connective tissue or glial cells, and that gives these receptors a fancy, an enlarged area near the end of the nerve. The unencapsulated tactile receptors found in our skin includes the free nerve endings, the tactile discs, and the root hair plexus. The encapsulated tactile receptors found in our skin include all the corpuscles. So we have the tactile corpuscle, the bulbous corpuscle, and the lamellar corpuscle that you guys are familiar with. Here you can see the free nerve endings, one of the three types of unencapsulated tactile receptors, and they are basically dendrites. They are mostly found in the papillary layer of the dermis, but we can also find them going up into the epidermis, as you can see here. These free nerve endings are found throughout our skin, and they have receptors that can detect light contact with our skin, so a little bit of pressure. But it can also detect temperature. So these free nerve endings have also thermoreceptors, and they also have pain receptors, which are called nociceptors. With that being said, you can conclude that the thermoreceptors as well as the nociceptors, which are the two other categories of receptors based on the nature of the stimulus they can detect, are also present at free nerve endings. Another type of unencapsulated tactile receptor are the so-called root hair plexus, and these are located in the dermis, and they are associated with hair follicles throughout our skin. You find them the surrounding hair follicles in the skin, and they're responsible for sensing movement of hairs on the body surface. So they act as light touch receptors that detect bending of hairs, and these are the receptors that allow us to feel when a mosquito lands on our skin, for example. Lastly, in the unencapsulated tactile receptors, we have the tactile discs, also called Merkel's discs, because they are found specifically associated with Merkel cells in the stratum basale of our epidermis. And Merkel cells are basically specialized epithelial cells that, in response to light touch on our skin, they release a neurotransmitter containing vesicles that can activate nerve fibers that send action potentials to our brain, and then we can feel that light touch. Now, for the encapsulated tactile receptors, we have here the tactile corpuscle. And as I mentioned before, all the encapsulated receptors will have they will be wrapped around with connective tissue and glial cells, and that will give them a more specialized function. So this one that we are seeing here, the tactile corpuscles, also called Meissner's corpuscle, they are found in the papillary layer of our dermis, and they are found in higher concentrations in areas like our fingertips, lips, nipples, and genitals, and they are involved with fine sensation in more like in sensitive parts of our body. And because they are actually involved in touch, they have the name of tactile corpuscles. So these are really good at discriminating touch throughout our body. It helps us to sense if something is rough or is smooth in texture, for example. And these receptors, they are capable of responding to low frequency vibrations that happens when objects are moved across our skin. So these are the receptors that are capable, that allow us to sense when something is moving in our skin in a place that there are no hairs. So such as when something is moving on top of our lips. Here you can see the bulbous corpuscle, another type of one of the types of the encapsulated tactile receptors, and these ones, they're found deep in our dermis, and as their location suggests, they respond to deep and continuous pressure, and also because of their shape that you see here, they detect stretch in our skin. Lastly, we have our well-known lamellated corpuscle, or also named lamellar and Pacini's corpuscle, that you guys learned in the first lab. So these are the large receptors that are located deep in the dermis, and they have this onion-like capsule around them. And they are, because they are located deeper in the dermis, they are sensitive to deep pressure and also to high-frequency vibrations. Another category of mechanoreceptors are the baroreceptors. And baroreceptors are the ones capable of detecting changes in pressure, like barometric pressure, hence the name baroreceptors, right? We find baroreceptors in areas like our digestive tract, lungs, urinary bladder, and also in our carotid and aortic sinus. And when we get to cardiovascular system, I will show you where the carotid and aortic sinus are located. Basically, the baroreceptors are located in areas of our bodies that detecting changes in pressure is necessary for those organs to function normally. So, for example, we have baroreceptors in the bladder, and they are the ones sensing that our bladder is full and informing us that we should do something about it. Lastly, under the mechanoreceptors, we have the so-called proprioceptors, and we already talked about these ones. They are the ones that let us sense things like body and limb movements. So we can be aware of where our arms are located even when our eyes are closed. And so this information provided by the proprioceptors, they are also integrated with sensory information from our inner ear. And then together, and we will talk about the sensory information that comes from our ear in the special senses, and together they tell us about our body position. So, continuing with the classification of receptors based on the type of stimuli that they are capable of detecting, we have the thermoreceptors, which are the ones capable of detecting change in temperature, and we have the nociceptors, which are the receptors related to pain sensation. Both of them, the thermoreceptors and the nociceptors, are free nerve endings. The thermoreceptors are mostly located in the superficial dermis, so in the papillary layer of the dermis, and the thermoreceptors are phasic receptors. They do get adapted. We get adapted to stable temperatures. On the other hand, the nociceptors are tonic receptors because they do not get adapted. The pain receptors detect tissue damage, and that's pain. We keep constantly receiving that information that something is wrong, something is damaged in our body. So anything that makes us feel pain activates nociceptors. So we have extreme temperatures activating nociceptors, mechanical damage, chemical damage, and even chemicals released from the damaged tissue activates our nociceptors. Anything that makes us feel pain activate our nociceptors, and they do not get adapted. They are tonic receptors. And as I mentioned before, nociceptors have very large receptive fields, and that's why it's very difficult to pinpoint the exact origin of the pain that we are feeling. One thing that I believe is very interesting about the pain sensation is what we call referred pain. And referred pain is a pain that's felt in a part of our body which is different from the origin of that pain. You might be familiar that during a heart attack, the person can feel pain radiating down the left arm, although this is nowhere near the heart. And this is called referred pain. There are lots of different referred pains around our body, such as pain of the liver and gallbladder can be felt in the right shoulder, and pain of the stomach is just generally felt in the abdominal area. So the reason why this happens is because the nerve fibers from a particular part of our body share the same pathway of another organ. And because they are sharing the same pathway back to the brain, our brain cannot differentiate between these two different locations. The last type of receptors we need to talk about are the chemoreceptors. And chemoreceptors are receptors sensitive to chemicals. Even though we do not feel the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our blood and cerebrospinal fluid, our brain is receiving that information from the chemoreceptors. And in fact, when we go hiking, of course not in Miami, right? When we go to high altitudes that the oxygen in the air is less, the chemoreceptors inform our brain that the oxygen level in our bloodstream is dropping. It's going down, and then our brain makes us breathe faster. So chemoreceptors are sensory receptors capable of detecting small changes in the chemical concentration of our blood and cerebrospinal fluid. And these receptors are found near the respiratory centers of the medulla oblongata and in the carotid and aortic bodies, which are specific places in our carotid arteries and aortic arch. So with this, we finish the general senses. Please make sure you watch the following videos about special senses. Bye!